My name is Daniel Reyes, and for 11 years, I have owned 2.5 acres at the edge of a quiet subdivision called Willow Bend Estates. Most of that land is taken up by something I built with my own hands, season after season, tree after tree, an orchard. 43 trees in total. Apple, pear, peach, a few stubborn cherry trees that took 4 years before they gave me a single piece of fruit worth eating. I didn't grow up around orchards. I grew up in an apartment on the 3rd floor of a building where the closest thing to nature was a potted basil plant my mother kept on the windowsill. So when my wife, Carla, and I finally saved enough to buy this property, the orchard wasn't just landscaping to me. It was proof that we'd made it. It was mine, and it was ours, and every spring when the blossoms came in white and pink waves across the property, I felt like the luckiest man in the state. I tell you all of this not to bore you with sentiment, but because you need to understand what was at stake before I tell you what the Homeowners Association tried to do to me, and what happened when the county showed up with a map that changed everything. This is a long story, so settle in. It has meetings that got heated, letters that got threatening, a fence crew that almost showed up uninvited, and an ending that, honestly, I still think about with a small, satisfied smile. Before I get into the conflict itself, let me paint you a clearer picture of what this orchard actually meant to our family. When Carla and I first walked the property with our real estate agent, the back half of the lot was nothing but overgrown grass and a few scraggly volunteer trees that had clearly seeded themselves years earlier. The agent called it unimproved yard space in her listing notes, like it was a floor to be worked around rather than a blank canvas. I saw it differently. I spent that first winter reading everything I could find about soil composition, drainage, and rootstock varieties suited to our climate. I planted my first 6 trees myself, badly, with a shovel that was too small and a level of confidence that was, in retrospect, wildly unearned. Half of them didn't survive that first year. But I learned, adjusted, and planted again the following spring, and the spring after that, until the trees I'd started with as awkward little saplings had grown into something that actually produced fruit worth sharing with neighbors. By the time the HOA sent its letter, that orchard had become something of a neighborhood fixture. Kids from down the street would sometimes ask if they could pick a peach on their way home from the bus stop. I never minded. It felt like the kind of thing a good neighborhood should have, not manicured, not fenced off from the world, just quietly generous. Let's start from the beginning. The new board. Willow Bend Estates had always been a fairly relaxed community. Our HOA existed mostly to maintain the entrance sign, mow the common green space near the clubhouse, and occasionally remind people not to park boats in their driveways for more than 72 hours. For almost a decade, that was the extent of its ambition. Then, 2 years ago, the board turned over. The old president, a retired schoolteacher named Walter who mostly just wanted everyone to get along, decided he'd had enough of meetings and stepped down. In his place came a woman named Renata Voss, along with 2 new board members who seemed to share her appetite for rules, enforcement, and what she liked to call restoring order to the neighborhood. At first, the changes were small. New paint color guidelines, a crackdown on mailbox styles, a memo about trampolines that nobody asked for. Annoying, but harmless. Then, last spring, Renata sent a notice to every household announcing a comprehensive boundary and common area review, explaining that the HOA wanted to make sure every property's fencing, landscaping, and structures matched the original community plat map from when the subdivision was built. I didn't think much of it. My orchard had been there for over a decade. I had a deed. I had a fence along part of my property line that had been there since before I bought the place. I figured the review would come and go like every other HOA initiative. A lot of paperwork, very little consequence. I was wrong. The letter. It arrived on a Tuesday in April, tucked into a plain white envelope with the HOA's logo stamped in the corner. I remember opening it at the kitchen table while Carla made coffee, and I remember the exact moment my stomach dropped. The letter stated that, according to the HOA's updated boundary assessment, approximately 600 square feet of my property, specifically, the section containing 11 of my fruit trees, including 3 mature peach trees that had taken me nearly a decade to grow into full production, was not actually part of my private lot. According to their assessment, that section was part of the community's designated common area, mistakenly enclosed within my existing fence line. The letter went on to say that the HOA intended to correct this encroachment by installing a new fence along what they claimed was the true property boundary, and that I would need to remove any trees or structures on the common area side of that new line within 30 days, or the HOA would arrange for their removal at my expense. I read it twice. Then a third time. I remember Carla asking what was wrong, and I remember my voice cracking slightly when I told her that Renata Voss wanted to cut down 11 of my trees because she believed a chunk of my backyard actually belonged to the neighborhood. That's insane, Carla said. You have a deed. You have a survey from when we bought the house. She was right. I did have both. So the next morning, I pulled out our closing documents, found the original survey from a sale, and confirmed what I already knew. My property line extended a full 12 feet past where the HOA claimed the boundary should be. The orchard, all of it, sat comfortably inside my land. I called the HOA office that afternoon, expecting a quick resolution. A simple mistake, corrected with a phone call. That is not what happened. The woman who answered the phone, a part-time administrative assistant named Kelly, was polite but clearly not equipped to resolve anything on the spot. She explained that the boundary review had been contracted out to a management consultant the board had hired specifically for this purpose, and that any dispute would need to go through a formal review request, which could take up to 2 weeks just to be scheduled, followed by an in-person meeting with the board. I remember hanging up the phone and standing in my kitchen for a long moment, looking out the window at the orchard, trying to imagine explaining to Carla, or to myself, why 11 productive fruit trees might need to come down because of a filing cabinet somewhere I'd never seen. It felt absurd. It also felt, underneath the absurdity, genuinely frightening, because I knew HOAs carried real legal authority in situations like this, and I had no idea, at that point, how strong my footing actually was. That night, I pulled every document related to the property out of a fireproof lockbox we kept in the closet, the original deed, the title insurance paperwork, and the plat survey our lender had required before closing. I spread them across the dining room table like pieces of a puzzle I was suddenly desperate to solve. Carla and I cross-referenced measurements for 2 hours, until we were both confident the survey clearly placed the disputed section of yard well within our own property line. That confidence helped, but it wasn't enough to make the anxiety disappear entirely. A deed is only as useful as someone's willingness to honor it, and I already sensed that Renata's board intended to move forward on its own timeline, regardless of what a decade-old survey said. The meeting. Renata Voss agreed to meet with me the following week, along with the HOA's newly hired property management consultant, a man named Curtis who wore a blazer that looked slightly too formal for a folding table conference room above the clubhouse pool. I brought my survey. I brought my deed. I laid them out on the table like a man presenting evidence in a trial, because in some sense, that's exactly what this felt like. Renata barely glanced at the documents. Mr. Reyes, I understand this is frustrating, she said, in the tone of someone who had rehearsed the sentence in the mirror. But our review was conducted using the original 1987 subdivision plat, which is the governing document for boundary determinations within the HOA, regardless of any individual survey performed later. My survey was performed by a licensed professional at the time of purchase, I said. It matches the county's recorded plat. Our consultant's review found discrepancies, Curtis interjected, sliding a folder across the table. Inside was a hand-drawn overlay, clearly produced on a computer using some kind of basic mapping software, showing a red dotted line slicing directly through my orchard. I asked where the underlying data for that overlay came from. Curtis said it was based on historical HOA records and community maintenance logs. Not a licensed survey. Not anything recorded with the county. A red line drawn by an HOA consultant, apparently confident enough in his own arithmetic to threaten the removal of trees. I left that meeting angrier than I had been in years, but also strangely calm, because I already had a plan forming in my head. If the HOA wanted to fight boundaries with unofficial maps and hand-drawn lines, I was going straight to the one place where boundaries actually mean something, the county recorder's office. Digging in. The next morning, I drove to the county administration building downtown. I'd never had a reason to visit before, and I'll admit I felt a little out of my depth walking up to the counter of the Land Records Division, holding a folder of documents like a man about to ask a doctor to double-check a diagnosis. The clerk who helped me, a patient woman named Ms. Alvarez, listened to my explanation and pulled up the subdivision's file without much fanfare. She explained that the county maintained the original recorded plat for Willow Bend Estates, filed back when the subdivision was first developed, along with all subsequent surveys tied to individual lots. Your HOA's boundary review, she said carefully, would need to be based on this recorded plat, not an internal document. If there's a discrepancy, we can pull the certified map and compare it directly against your lot's recorded survey. I asked her to do exactly that. It took about a week for the official request to process, largely because the county surveyor's office wanted to confirm they were pulling the correct historical documents, cross-referencing amendments made over the decades, including one adjustment to the community's common area boundary that had been formally recorded 15 years earlier, long before I ever bought the property. When Ms. Alvarez called to tell me the documents were ready, she said something that made my pulse pick up. "Mr. Reyes, I think you're going to want to see this in person." The real map. I sat across from a county surveyor named Mr. Whitfield, a soft-spoken man with reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, as he unrolled the certified plat map across a wide table. He traced his finger along the boundary lines of Willow Bend Estates, then tapped a specific point near the edge of the subdivision. "This is your lot," he said, "and this is the common area designated for the HOA." He tapped again, several feet away from where the HOA's hand-drawn overlay had placed the line. "Your fence and your orchard sit entirely within your private lot, according to the officially recorded boundary." But that wasn't the part that made me sit up straighter. Mr. Whitfield continued, explaining that 15 years earlier, a formal boundary adjustment had been filed and recorded, shifting a small section of what had originally been common area to accommodate a utility easement requested by the county itself. That adjustment had been properly filed, properly recorded, and was part of the certified public record. The HOA's internal 1987 plat, that Renata and Curtis had referenced during our meeting, was outdated by over a decade. It did not reflect this recorded change. In other words, the HOA wasn't just wrong about where my property line sat. They were relying on a map that had been legally superseded years before their own consultant ever drew his red dotted line. And there was one more detail, one that Mr. Whitfield mentioned almost as an afterthought, but which would end up mattering more than anything else in this entire story. "There's actually a small strip on the opposite side of the common area," he said, pointing to a different section of the map entirely, "that the HOA has been maintaining as part of their green space for years. According to this recorded boundary, that strip was never part of the common area to begin with. It was always part of a neighboring private lot." I asked whose lot that was. He checked the parcel number against the ownership record, running his finger down a column of numbers on a separate printout, comparing it against the parcel identifier stamped in the corner of my own deed. It was mine. He said it plainly, without any particular drama in his voice, the way a man says something he deals with regularly and doesn't find especially remarkable. But for me, sitting across that table, it felt like the floor had tilted slightly beneath my chair. I asked him to repeat it, just to be sure I'd understood correctly, and he traced the boundary line again with his finger, confirming that the strip in question, nearly 200 square feet of grass, a decorative shrub bed, and part of the walking path near the mailbox kiosk, had been recorded as part of my parcel since the boundary adjustment 15 years earlier. "To be fair," Mr. Whitfield added, almost sympathetically, "this kind of thing happens more often than people realize. Community associations rely on old internal maps for years, sometimes decades, without ever cross-referencing them against updated county records. Nobody usually notices until a situation like yours forces the comparison." The HOA hadn't just threatened to cut down trees inside my property. For years, without realizing it, they had actually been mowing, maintaining, and treating as their own a separate strip of land that legally belonged to me the entire time. I sat there for a long moment, trying to process the sheer irony of it. The HOA had spent months building a case to take land away from me based on a map that didn't exist in any official capacity, while sitting, quite literally, on land that was mine and always had been. I requested certified copies of everything: the current recorded plat, the 15-year-old boundary adjustment, and a formal letter from the surveyor's office confirming both boundary lines in writing. Ms. Alvarez assured me these documents would hold up as the official record in any dispute, HOA or otherwise. I thanked them both, walked out to my car, and sat behind the wheel for a solid 5 minutes before I trusted myself to drive home. I wasn't angry anymore. I was something closer to amused, in the way you feel when you realize the person threatening you has been holding their argument upside down the entire time. The notice they didn't expect. I could have simply mailed the documents to the HOA office and let the matter resolve quietly through paperwork. Part of me considered it. But another part of me remembered the tone Renata had used in that first meeting, the certainty in her voice as she explained that my survey didn't matter compared to their internal review, and I decided this deserved a proper resolution, one witnessed by the neighbors who had received the same unsettling boundary letters I had. The HOA's monthly meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. I requested a spot on the agenda under new business, citing the boundary review as my topic. The request was approved, likely because I showed up with a folder. The clubhouse meeting room was fuller than usual that night. Word travels fast in a subdivision of 200 homes, and apparently I wasn't the only one who had received a boundary letter. 3 other families, I later learned, had gotten similar notices, though none involved anything as dramatic as an orchard full of decade-old trees. Renata called the meeting to order, ran through routine business, a pool maintenance schedule, a dispute about holiday decorations, and then reached my agenda item. "Mr. Reyes, you wanted to discuss the boundary review," she said, in the same rehearsed tone from our first meeting. "I did," I said, standing up. "I wanted to share what I found when I brought the matter to the county." I laid out the certified plat map on the table at the front of the room, angled so the board and the audience could see it. I explained, calmly and without raising my voice, that the boundary the HOA had used in the letter was based on an outdated 1987 document that did not reflect a legally recorded adjustment made 15 years prior. I explained that my orchard sat entirely within my private lot according to the current, certified record. Then I got to the part I'd been waiting to say. "And there's one more thing," I said, pulling out the surveyor's letter. "According to this same certified map, a strip of land the HOA has been maintaining as part of the common green space, near the mailbox kiosk, was never actually common area. It's part of my lot." The room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when something unexpected and slightly delicious has just happened. Renata's expression shifted, just slightly, from confident to something closer to careful. Curtis, sitting beside her, reached for the folder in front of him as though the paperwork might rearrange itself if he stared at it hard enough. "That can't be correct," Renata said. "Our records." "Outdated," I said, sliding copies of the certified documents toward the board. "These are current. They're recorded with the county. I'd be happy to have the surveyor's office confirm this directly with your legal counsel, if that would help." The room turns. What happened over the next 20 minutes was, in hindsight, one of the most satisfying stretches of silence and stammering I have ever witnessed at a community meeting. One of the other board members, a quieter man named Phil who mostly nodded along to whatever Renata proposed, actually spoke up for the first time that evening. He asked to see the county surveyor's letter, read it carefully, and then asked Curtis directly whether the 1987 plat used for the entire boundary review had ever been cross-checked against current county records. Curtis admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that it had not. The review had been based entirely on older HOA maintenance files and a scanned copy of the original plat, without pulling updated records from the county. Another homeowner in the audience, a woman named Priya who had also received a boundary letter about her back fence, asked whether her situation would need to be reviewed using the same outdated map. Renata, visibly working to keep her composure, said the entire boundary review would need to be paused pending further verification. I could have stopped there. The point had been made. But I decided to add one more thing, because I felt the room deserved context, not just correction. "I want to be clear," I said, "that I don't think anyone did this out of malice. Mistakes happen, especially with old paperwork. But I'd ask that going forward, any boundary determination affecting someone's property, especially one that involves removing trees or structures, be verified against the county's certified records before a letter goes out threatening removal at a homeowner's expense." There were a few nods around the room. Even Renata, after a pause, said that seemed like a reasonable policy going forward. Priya raised her hand again, this time with a question that clearly had the whole room's attention. "So does this mean my letter is on hold too? I already had a contractor give me a quote to move my fence, and I was planning to schedule it next month." "Everything is on hold," Phil said, before Renata could answer, "until we've verified every affected property against the current county records, not the old plat." He looked over at Curtis. "All of them. Not just Mr. Reyes's." Curtis nodded, somewhat stiffly, and made a note on his laptop. I got the sense, watching his expression, that this evening had turned into a considerably longer night of work for him than he'd originally planned. The meeting moved on to other business after that, though the energy in the room had shifted noticeably. People who had been quietly scrolling their phones during the pool maintenance discussion were now leaning forward, paying attention, occasionally whispering to the person next to them. I noticed several neighbors approaching me afterward, some to ask questions about their own boundary letters, one older gentleman named Frank simply shaking my hand and saying, "Good for you, son." Somebody needed to push back. Priya caught up with me in the parking lot and asked for the county land officer's contact information, since she wanted her own certified survey before agreeing to move a single fence post. I gave her Ms. Alvarez's direct line and told her the process, while intimidating at first, had been far more straightforward than I expected. A retired couple named the Hendersons mentioned they'd received a similar letter about a shed they'd built years earlier, and asked if they should also request certified county records before responding. I told them what I genuinely believed, that in any dispute where a decision threatens something you've built with your own hands, it's worth checking the primary source before assuming a letter in your mailbox is the final word. The follow-up. The HOA's boundary review was formally suspended the following week. 2 weeks after that, I received a second letter, considerably shorter than the first. It confirmed, in plain language, that my property boundary matched my original survey, that no trees or structures on my land were in violation of any common area boundary, and that the HOA's records would be updated to reflect the correct property lines going forward. There was no formal apology in the letter, which didn't surprise me. HOA correspondence rarely admits fault directly, but there was, buried in the final paragraph, an acknowledgement that the strip of land near the mailbox kiosk had indeed been misclassified for years, and that the HOA would need to either formally lease that section from me for continued maintenance or adjust their landscaping boundary accordingly. I chose the simpler option. I told the board, at the next meeting, that they were welcome to continue maintaining that small strip as they always had, free of charge, as a gesture of goodwill, provided the boundary review process moving forward always started with the county's actual records rather than internal guesswork. Renata agreed, somewhat stiffly, and the matter was formally closed. I did request one thing in writing, though, reimbursement for the cost of pulling the certified county documents, since I had incurred that expense directly because of an error on the HOA's part. It wasn't a large sum, maybe $80 in total, but it felt important to have it acknowledged. The board approved it without objection at the following meeting. The orchard, still standing. It's been almost a year since that meeting in the clubhouse conference room. My orchard is still exactly where it has always been, 43 trees, 11 of which nearly disappeared under a fence crew's saw blades over a boundary dispute built on outdated paperwork and a hand-drawn red line that never should have carried the weight it did. This past spring, the blossoms came in heavier than I'd ever seen them, and I stood out there one morning with a cup of coffee, looking at the peach trees that Renata's consultant had marked for removal, thinking about how close I'd come to losing something I'd spent a decade building, simply because nobody had bothered to check the county's actual records before sending a threatening letter. I don't share this story to villainize an entire HOA board. Boards are made up of volunteers, mostly well-meaning people who sometimes move too quickly, trust the wrong internal documents, or get caught up in the authority of a title without fully understanding its limits. What I want people to take from this is simpler than that. If a homeowners association, or anyone else, tells you that your property doesn't belong to you the way you think it does, don't just take their word for it, and don't panic either. Go to the source. County recorders' offices exist precisely for moments like this. Certified plat maps, recorded surveys, and boundary adjustments are public record for a reason, because boundaries shouldn't be decided by whoever draws the most confident line on a piece of paper. My orchard is still standing because I refuse to let a red dotted line, drawn without any legal basis, define the edge of something I had spent years building with my own hands. And somewhere in a folder in my home office, next to the original deed to this property, sits a certified county map with my name on it, quietly proving that some lines, once properly drawn, are worth defending until someone with the actual authority to draw them agrees with you. The trees are still there. The fence never went up. And every spring, when the blossoms come in white and pink across the yard, I think about how close it all came to being cut down over a mistake that a single phone call to the county could have prevented from the very beginning. That's the whole story. Thank you for sticking with me through it, and if you've ever dealt with a boundary dispute of your own, HOA or otherwise, I'd genuinely like to hear how it turned out for you.